not. All right. So again, morning. Today we're going to talk about testing and the surveillance testing that's happening in Trinidad and Tobago. And we are also going to talk about the how we treat with asymptomatic COVID-19, people who have COVID-19 and they are asymptomatic. Right, so those are the two main topics. I want to give a little context because you all know that I have been advocating for COVID-19, widespread COVID-19 testing for quite some time in Trinidad and Tobago. I have been speaking about the fact that we should not just test symptomatic people, who are the people we are currently testing, and that we should broaden it out and do the wider definition and use the wider definition of surveillance testing. That is what I think we should be doing. And that is what I am hoping that we would have started doing, but that is not quite what we are doing just now. So let me start by stating that last week Friday, I think it was, last week Friday, our new Secretary for Health, Wellness and Family Development, Mrs. Tracy Davidson Celestine, she made an announcement about the kind of testing that's happening in Tobago. And when she said it, I was like, yes, finally, great, wonderful, wonderful, wonderful. But then after I started listening to it, I realized that she may have said it, but that may not necessarily be what is actually happening in Trinidad and Tobago, or in Tobago specifically. So that is why I wanted to talk about this specifically and highlight some of the discrepancies that I am hearing, because it can affect us and it can affect how we respond. So let me start by sharing with you what Mrs. Davidson Celestine said on Friday at the Tobago House of Assembly's media briefing. All right, so let me pull that up and let's start playing so you would hear what she said on Friday.
Confirmation today that community surveillance
dedicated facilities here. Additionally, we have submitted about 131 tests to CARFA to date. The number of persons testing positive still remain at 5, and that has been for quite some time now. What I would want to communicate to you in addition, members of the public, is that we have begun the process of community testing, or public health officials out there in the communities testing anyone and everyone who exhibits any traditional signs and symptoms of COVID, as well as persons displaying any unusual presentations, because over the last few weeks we have seen instances where, or there is evidence to suggest that even persons with strokes are likely to be tested for COVID. And so here in Tobago, and I'm sure it's the same in Trinidad as well, we want to ensure that in our communities there is no one with COVID, and we have expanded the reach to ensure that we have more tests being done, and to be comfortable that we have no COVID in our communities out there in Tobago. And like I've said in all my press conferences, I encourage members of the communities, I encourage persons to come forward for testing. That is, if you have, displayed any signs and symptoms related to COVID, or even any unusual signs and symptoms, as I would have indicated earlier. Our hotlines have been up and running. They are very well established, and when you call, we will immediately schedule an appointment for testing at the very earliest convenience.
Okay, so you heard what Secretary Tracy Davidson Celestine just said. She basically indicated that anyone with signs and symptoms will be tested and that they're doing widespread testing in Tobago. When I heard this, I almost jumped up on my chair and started screaming because yes, at least it's not as far as I would like us to go, but it is further than where we have gone. And then I thought, I'm not sure that she's really representing what is really happening in Trinidad and Tobago. And this is only important. This is only important because we are currently still sending our samples to Trinidad. Tobago isn't testing just yet. We are currently still sending our samples to Trinidad. And because we are currently still sending our samples to Trinidad, we have to be careful that we are following the same rules, because we may jump up, send samples, and then the samples get rejected because we did not follow the rules. See, if Tobago was testing on our own, it didn't matter. We could say, well, everybody who comes to our health centers with flu and cold and flu-like symptoms would get tested because we are doing it ourselves. But because we still have to send it to Trinidad, we still have to be very conscious about that. And let me play something for you that was the CMO basically answering that particular question in terms of who gets tested. And this is from some time ago, maybe a week or two ago, this report came up. So you could listen to this one.
Surveillance testing has begun throughout the country. Chief Medical Officer Dr. Roshan Parasram says one health center in each of the 8 counties in Trinidad and 1 in Tobago has been sending a sample a day for testing.
The Caribbean Public Health Agency will give me a disaggregated report for those particular patients as separate from the other samples they are receiving. Hopefully in the next 2 days or so, we should start to see those results coming forward as well.
He says the plan is to expand on this.
Up and running, we will probably look at expanding because CAFA has to do testing both at the community level as well as our routine sampling. So they have, of course, some constraints, but once we get our sampling up and running, we'll be able to expand our community initiative in a week or two.
Okay, so I hope you guys were able to hear the distinct difference in what he said. The CMO basically said that we will have one health center in each county take samples from their cohort, from their catchment, and send it to get tested. That is one health center in each county take samples and send it to get tested, which is very, very different. That's very, very different to just testing anyone or testing everybody who is interested in getting tested, everyone who is at the point where they are showing signs and symptoms, which is basically what the secretary in Tobago said. So there is some discrepancy there. And it is something that we have to consider because if we are in Tobago, testing in Tobago, it doesn't matter. But if we have to send our samples to Trinidad, we may then pick up the samples, send them, and then they do not test them because it does not fit in the criteria that they are using. So that is something that's critical. That's something that is important. And that is something that we have to be conscious of, because we don't want to give people false hope. We don't want people to think, I got swabbed, I'm getting tested, and in fact they don't get tested. So that's one thing that I wanted us to highlight, and that is something, if there are any members of the media, maybe you guys can have the secretary with responsibility for health, wellness, and family development clear up that difference in who actually gets tested in Tobago, because that is an important difference for us to be very clear on. Okay, so that's the first thing that I wanted to chat about. The second thing I want to chat about is the fact that in Trinidad and Tobago, the Minister for Health continually speaks about the fact that the testing that we are doing in Trinidad and Tobago is limited to symptomatic people. And I wanted to focus on that as the more important part of this live, because we are seeing all over the world where it is important for us to highlight who our asymptomatic people are in Trinidad and Tobago, all over the world as it relates to COVID-19. But before I go into that discussion, I want you to hear for yourself what was said on, I think it was Saturday, one of the press conferences over the week, and I think it was Saturday, where the question came up about who should get tested and about whether asymptomatic people would give a positive result, and whether it's important to test people who are asymptomatic. So let me just pull that up really quickly for you to see that comment from Saturday.
Yes, good morning. Akila Bihola, Tobago Channel 5.
Good morning.
My question is for Minister Dayal Singh.
Sure.
Minister Dayal Singh, earlier this week you would have mentioned that the community testing should only test persons who are symptomatic, as it doesn't make much sense to test persons that are asymptomatic. However, I had conversations with one public health professional, and they stated that by leaving out asymptomatic persons, they will fall through the net and they may go about unknowingly infect persons. Could you just comment on that and clarify that position and whether the government would have taken that into consideration?
Okay. As has been stated by every medical expert who has been on this panel for the past month, testing asymptomatic people will yield you no useful result. As the health experts have said, up to Wednesday, when Professor Christine Carrington was here, she's a molecular, what was her title? Geneticist and virologist. All the medical experts have said clearly that if you are asymptomatic and we test you, you will get a negative result. It is not good policy, and it will be a complete waste of scarce resources in times of a global pandemic. As I said in the Senate yesterday in reply to the same issue from Senator Wade Mark, countries that tested randomly asymptomatic persons are now living to regret that decision because it led those countries into a false sense of security. So, as Minister of Health, we stand by the expertise of our medical professionals in the Ministry of Health and buttressed by the University of the West Indies on Wednesday that testing asymptomatic people will yield no useful result. I hope that answers your question.
Okay, so we hear what he is saying. And I agree with what he's saying to some degree, particularly the part about if we have limited resources. If we have very limited resources, then it may not be the best use of our limited resources to test people who are asymptomatic. But that works. That is an issue. That is a consideration when we have limited resources. In Trinidad and Tobago, we all are aware of the fact that even though we are not the wealthiest country on earth, we are not as badly off as it relates to having resources to deal with COVID-19 as many other places. So if it was a decision between, it's the last $100 and we have to figure out how to spend our last $100, then sure, let us not test asymptomatic people. But if we have monies, and by the way, I will forever bring back to the public the fact that we were very willing and we had enough money somewhere put down to hire 4 private security companies at a whim to help us treat with COVID-19 without, there was no worry. I mean, it was really only after Trinidad and Tobago pushed back that they pulled those contracts from those 4 private security companies. So Trinidad and Tobago is not a space that has limited resources when it comes to these things. We know how to spend money when we want to spend money. Okay? Let me also say that the minister has continually said, inaccurately too, that people who are asymptomatic will not test positive for COVID-19. He continues to say that people who are asymptomatic will not test positive for COVID-19. And that is also an inaccurate statement. What I have noticed though, because I think his professionals have told him that that statement is inaccurate, you realize he's now putting a caveat that it would yield no useful information. When before, what he said is you would not get a positive test. He said it several times that you will not get a positive test at all, which is inaccurate. Let me take a little bit of time, Joe, to define what these terms means. There are three terms that we have to think of: asymptomatic, pre-symptomatic, and symptomatic as it relates to COVID-19. People who are asymptomatic are people who don't have signs and symptoms, whether it is the cough, whether it is fever, whatever it is. You are asymptomatic, meaning you do not have symptoms, okay? There are some people who have had the benefit because of a wide myriad of reasons, who have COVID-19 and never show signs and symptoms at all. They have it and they never show signs and symptoms. So that is one thing that's important. So those are asymptomatic people. There are also people, excuse me, there are also people who we classify as pre-symptomatic. Pre meaning before, meaning they will eventually show signs and symptoms, whether those signs are severe, whether they are mild or whatever. They are not at the stage where they start showing signs and symptoms yet. So they are pre-symptomatic. And then there are people who are symptomatic, meaning they are currently showing the signs and symptoms. They currently have a fever. They currently have a sore throat. They currently have headache. They currently have, or whatever are the flu-like symptoms that we are looking at. So we have these three levels of people. There are some people who are asymptomatic and will continue to be asymptomatic. There are some people who are pre-symptomatic, meaning they have not shown any signs and symptoms yet, but they will eventually start showing signs. Some may be very mild signs. Some may be very, very mild, to the point where, you may just have one day gotten a slight headache, but because you were so busy up and down, you didn't even think about it. You may have just popped some, Tylenol or Panadol or something, and your headache went away, and that was it. Now, you may have COVID-19, but that was all. That was the sum total of your symptoms. And there are people like that. That is why we've always said from the get-go that from the data that we have collected about COVID-19, the vast majority of people are going to have actually mild or moderate symptoms, to the point where they don't have to go to the hospital. They don't have to be hospitalized. It's not worth them going in and they're not having breathing problems that's really difficult, or it's not, they are not so sick that they absolutely need to be hospitalized. And the more we learn about COVID-19, we are actually recognizing that there actually may be a larger proportion of people who are asymptomatic and who have mild or medium or moderate symptoms. Okay, now I want to draw your attention to what happened on some of the Navy ships in the United States, because we have these kind of test tube examples where we are learning a lot from these test tube examples. And when I say test tube, meaning because of how they are, because of their physical structure, because of the circumstances around them, we can study them specifically because of how it happened, because of where it happened, and so forth. I'm seeing that somebody's asking whether asymptomatic people can transmit the virus. And that is another thing that's critical, because a lot of the studies have shown is that when you look at when you look at the rate of infection, meaning how many people have gotten infected, in many instances, the only thing they could have deduced was that some of these infections came from asymptomatic people. That was the only thing they could have deduced after a while. And that is why it is also important, because remember, the virus spreads. And let me just go back a second before going to that Navy ship thing. The virus spreads through droplets. Droplets go further and are more in number when you have symptoms. So if you're coughing and you're sneezing, yes, we've all experienced it. You happen to be right in front of a child, for example, a baby or a toddler who has a cold, and they cough and they sneeze, and you feel it hitting your face. Those are the droplets. I'm sure we've all experienced it. But we also know that about a couple days after you've been infected, even if you are not sneezing or coughing just yet, you can also shed the virus because it is multiplying in your system. And even the act of speaking allows droplets to get out of your mouth. Again, I am sure we have all experienced talking to somebody and their boulders hitting you. They're not necessarily shouting. They're not necessarily, upset or anything like that, but you are feeling their mouth water hitting you. So yes, if that person has the virus inside of them, the same way you're feeling the mouth water hitting you, then yes, it's still hitting you. Another example, if we are talking to somebody and we could smell that they had onions or they had food that had garlic, the fact that we are smelling that means that there is something coming out of their mouth and going into the air and hitting our nose. So just the fact that you can smell what somebody's breath smells like, you can smell what they have eaten, means that there is something coming out of their mouth going into the air, and that is where the virus can last. So yes, you can shed virus even if you do not have symptoms. You can spread it. So let you hear now a report about what they're seeing in some of these Navy ships in the United States of America right now. We knew of one case where there was a whole big bacchanal where one of the commanders, I'm not sure if that's his title, but one of the leadership on this Navy ship actually got dismissed because he was the one who started making a loud public hoopla about people on the ship getting COVID-19. So listen to this.
1,700 cases of coronavirus have been confirmed in the Navy. That's the latest number after yet another ship is hit by COVID-19. This time, the USS Ronald Reagan. It's docked in Yokosuka, Japan, and has been since the DoD ordered a 2-week stop movement to create a virus-free environment. Navy spokesman Rachel McCarr says sailors who tested positive had been sequestered at surrounding bases, including Naval Air Station Atsugi and Yokota Air Base, away from others. She says these measures were taken 2 weeks ago, but according to a Task Force 70 spokesperson, the sailors that showed no symptoms were tested over the weekend as their mandated isolation came to an end. And that's when they discovered they were carrying the virus. This restriction of movement period allowed fleet leadership the ability to monitor the health of the force daily in a controlled and secured environment while conducting tests for COVID-19 before returning sailors to their units. This is a proactive preventative measure designed to minimize the potential risk of exposure to our sailors and their families. The USS Theodore Roosevelt and USS Nimitz also had multiple confirmed cases of the virus on board.
Any sailor that tests positive for COVID-19 will remain in isolation until their test results come back negative. Therese Garnier, Newsy, Washington.
So there it is. On that ship, on those two ships, because again, it's a special kind of case, because they're a control group of people, because of who they are and because of the potential of spread, they recognize that even those people who were on the ship, even though they were asymptomatic, even though they were asymptomatic, they still tested positive for COVID-19. And again, remember, we are in a situation where we are still learning a lot about COVID-19. We still don't know a lot about COVID. We absolutely don't know a whole lot about COVID. So we need to take as many precautions as we possibly can to ensure that we are not putting ourselves at any undue risk because of it. And again, because we what we don't want, what we don't want is a situation where we didn't think about the asymptomatic people. We did not treat with asymptomatic people. And because of it, we have to learn the hard way after the fact that we should have dealt with it. Winston is asking, can asymptomatic persons build immunity over time? The question about immunity as it relates to COVID-19 is one where we don't have the answer. There are two kinds of tests that are currently being done for COVID-19. One of the tests is the PCR test, which actually looks at the RNA, the genetic material of it looks for the genetic material of the virus. That's one test. So that is actually looking for the virus itself. The other kind of test that is available, that there are still questions about the accuracy of some of the tests that are already out on the market, are the antibody tests, meaning these are the tests that don't look for the virus itself, but these are the tests that look for our body's immune response to the virus. So it looks for the antibodies. There are people who are showing that they have antibodies to COVID-19, to the SARS-CoV-2 virus. So yes, that has been established that our bodies do develop antibodies. What we don't know, simply because there hasn't been enough time yet, is how long those antibodies stay in our system and whether that means that we are immune to it in the future. So that is a question that we don't know the answer to just yet. We don't know whether we don't know how long those who seem to have immunity, meaning they have antibodies, we don't know how long those people will stay immune for. We simply don't know. These are questions we are going to have to keep asking. And as time goes along, we would end up with better answers a year later, 2 years later. It's one of the reasons why there are questions about a vaccine too, because we don't know if SARS-CoV-2, the virus that causes COVID-19, we don't know if that virus is similar to HIV, because remember, as much as we've been trying to get a vaccine for HIV, we haven't been able to get a vaccine for HIV for some reason. So again, that is another thing that we have to be conscious of, that we really don't know the answer just yet. Hi, Thessia, how are you? Welcome, welcome, welcome. Welcome to everybody who has joined thus far. So yes, that's critical for us to be conscious of the fact that we're really not sure about the immunity as it relates to SARS-CoV-2 or COVID-19. So once there are antibodies, would it not be logically follow that a person has immunity? No, because we are not sure how long that immunity lasts. That's why, for example, with other flus like H1N1 and so forth, if you recognize, every year you have to get a new flu vaccine, because the immunity you developed to that virus last year will not work on the virus this year, because the virus mutates that quickly. That's why every year you have to take a different flu vaccine. If it worked where you got lifelong immunity, then you would only need to take one vaccine and you would need to take more flu vaccines. So that's a situation which that applies to H1N1, and we don't know again whether it applies to coronavirus, SARS-CoV-2. Now, another thing that I wanted to highlight from what the minister said about asymptomatic people is that he seemed to state that the countries that have done widespread testing are the countries that are now backpedaling because they kind of opened up, they were too confident and they opened up their economy too quickly, and they now have to backpedal because it has not worked to their benefit. Now, that is also not true. And it's a false connection between the two things. Because there are countries that have done widespread testing that have actually gotten very, very good results and are still getting very good results. And I would just use a little bit of time now to highlight what has happened in Iceland. What has happened in Iceland. I'm going to bring up, and because I want you to be able to read it, I am going to bring up, so let me just talk about Iceland for a little bit. Iceland is a country that has about 360 or so thousand people. That is the population of Iceland. So by no means is it as huge as Trinidad and Tobago in terms of population size. But when I look at these things, to be honest, I am very Tobago-centric in my thinking. So when I look at these things, I look at this from the standpoint of the Tobago House of Assembly and what we can do in Tobago, because that is critical to, I'm Tobagoan first, everything else after. It is what it is. So Iceland has about 360,000 people. That's the size of their population. And Iceland has been able to do absolutely fantastic, amazing work. As a matter of fact, let me now just put in the comments where I'm pulling this data. I don't know if I can actually do it. Where I'm pulling this data from as it relates to Iceland. I may have to do it after. Where if you just search Iceland COVID-19 data, you would see the official COVID-19 page that Iceland has created. But I want to draw your attention to a scientific article that was written about Iceland, and I want to highlight some of the critical aspects of that report about Iceland to show that yes, there are issues with reopening too soon in other countries because of other issues, but if we look at Iceland as a perfect example thus far, we can emulate Iceland in Tobago, even if Trinidad doesn't want to do it, which again is why I've always advocated for the THA to take responsibility for our response, because even though they don't want to do something in Trinidad, the fifth schedule of the Tobago House of Assembly Act says that the THA is responsible for health, and we have significant responsibilities that we need to take care of. So I'm going to show you some of the text of this article. I'll go through it very quickly. I would probably also post, or you could just search for it online. I would show you this, and I would get rid of my screen so that you have a full access to the screening. And I'm just going to bring myself up a little bit just to highlight something for you. Remember, 6% of the population. I'll go back and talk a little bit about the categories of people they screen. But in Trinidad and Tobago, let's just say we use a ballpark figure of 2,000. We have yet not tested 2,000 people total in Trinidad and Tobago. If we use a liberal population sample size of 1,003 million, and I know we have more than 1,003 million people in Tobago, it means that we have only tested 0.154% of our population. Iceland, they tested 6% of the population. In Trinidad and Tobago, we have not even tested 1%. We haven't even tested 0.5% of our population. Okay, so let's just think about that a little. positive for COVID-19 but are not symptomatic. Again, I want to highlight that fact. There are people who test positive for COVID-19, but they are not showing signs and symptoms. It's possible that at the time they were not showing signs and symptoms. If it's possible that they remain asymptomatic, because remember before we were talking about the fact that we have asymptomatic versus pre-symptomatic people. They may then 2 or 3 days later show signs and symptoms, but at the time when the test was done, they didn't have signs and symptoms, and so forth. So this whole idea of not testing the population, not testing larger proportions of the population, and certainly not testing people who are asymptomatic just does not make sense. And again, I'm going back to the fact that I don't want to say I don't care, because this is Trinidad and Tobago and I care about the country. But we are talking about Tobago, and Tobago needs to take full responsibility for what happens on the island of Tobago. So even if Trinidad does not think it is necessary to do this kind of larger scale testing, Tobago needs to take up that mantle and take up the responsibility of doing it. Again, I've said on several occasions that the issue with money is it's an excuse that I am not going to buy. I don't care. It is an excuse that I am not going to buy. I did the calculations. If we test 1 in every 100 people in Tobago, whether they are symptomatic or not, with 60,000 people, that's 600 tests. CARFA said that the test cost $250 US. When you do the calculations, multiply that by 7, multiply that by 600, it is $1,050,000. Trinidad and Tobago, we spend that kind of money on foolishness all the time anyway. So spending it on testing our people is something that we can do and we should do. It is an investment. It is an investment that we need to make for our people, because it's what we need to do. And the last thing I am going to show you, is really an overview of what has happened in Iceland, so that you get a sense of why this is important, how this is important, and why this is important. And it is coming from not me, this little, some doctor from Tobago that always talking and always complaining and always, listen to this report from Iceland, and you would see why it is so absolutely important for us to expand. And again, as I said, even if they don't do it in Trinidad, that is their business, but we need to take responsibility for what we do on this island. Let's see here. And I think I'm going to remove myself from the screen so that
You might have thought that an island nation hundreds of miles away from any landmass would have been a reassuringly safe place to be in recent weeks. But in that time, the mesmerizing beauty of the so-called land of fire and ice enticed in plenty of visitors. Icelanders themselves headed in and out for work and pleasure. In a world of mass travel, remoteness is no insurance against a virus spread by people. And yet this small nation hit back against the arrival of COVID with a strategy of test, 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 and unusually not just on the sick, but the seemingly healthy. Not a single person in this busy private clinic has shown the faintest sign of having the virus, but they've turned up anyway to be tested, for reassurance, to make sure they don't spread disease unwittingly, and to provide blood for research into antibodies to fight COVID.
I want to help, and I want to be safe. If I'm going to have an answer tomorrow and it's yes, so I have to stay home.
As part of our social responsibility, I feel responsible to come and just do the test to make sure that me and the people I live with, I'm virus-free.
Iceland now believes it has tested a higher percentage of people than any other nation. More than 45,000 samples have been taken from a population of just 360,000. Over 40% of those who tested positive had no symptoms at the time and were quickly isolated. The country's Prime Minister admits being a small nation has its advantages, but they're keen to share what they've learned with the world.
In a small country, people really, it's easier to get information to everybody. I think we have shown a lot of solidarity also, and that's very Icelandic, maybe because we're a small nation on an island and we tend to argue about everything, but when we are really hit with something difficult, we tend to show a very strong solidarity, and we've been doing that.
But testing is only part of Iceland's success story, which has seen the number of cases drop to a daily handful, on one day recently none at all. Huge effort has gone into tracking contacts of people confirmed to be infected.
Apparently you are in Iceland at the moment?
Detective Chief Inspector Gestur Parmason is part of a tracing team which at one point was 160 strong. A veteran of counter-terrorism and organised crime, he's using old-fashioned investigative skills to locate people who've been close to those who tested positive. The phone app, which can trace where people have been, is now helping in that effort.
The rule of thumb is if you've been within 2 meters for more than 15 minutes of an individual, you're believed to be a contact. So once we've gathered all your contacts, we call the contacts and tell them that they have to go into quarantine for 2 weeks.
Iceland's approach of test, track and isolate has allowed it to avoid some of the more draconian restrictions imposed by other nations. But the government has now decided anyone entering the country has to quarantine. Believing they've got on top of the virus, they don't want to risk travellers spreading it again. Michelle Clifford, Sky News, Reykjavik, Iceland.
So there it is. There it is. Iceland has been very, very, very proactive, and they have taken full advantage of their small size to ensure that their response to this has been amazing. Can I just say really quickly, you realize that the head of Iceland is female? Just saying, the women have been doing a really good job at this. The women have been doing a very, very good job at responding to COVID-19. Now, the reason, let me just say one more quick thing. The reason they are asking us to wear a mask, a cloth mask, is because they are asking us to protect other people from ourselves. And that is because we don't know if we have it. I have never been tested for SARS-CoV-2. I don't know if I have it. I don't have symptoms, signs and symptoms, but because of that understanding that me just talking to somebody in their very close presence could mean that I hand it over to them, that I infect them, is why they are asking all of us. No, it is not a law. No, they are not demanding that they do it. But they are asking all of us to wear the cloth mask just in case. And that is, again, because there is enough evidence showing that even if you are asymptomatic, when you go out there and you interact with other people, you can spread the disease. It is a fact. So this idea of only testing very limited people or only testing people who are symptomatic is the strategy that is going to set us up for failure. It is the strategy that is going to allow us to be too confident. We've seen already, and I am already experiencing it. You are experiencing it. We have not had a positive case in Trinidad and Tobago for the last week and a half. And people are listening and people are saying, well, if we don't have a positive case, then what we worried about? Let me go ahead and how we harvest. Let me go ahead and do what we're supposed to do. But you have to recognize that Trinidad and Tobago has not tested even 1% of the population. And they are only testing people who are symptomatic, who show up. And that's the other thing. The surveillance that is currently happening now within our health system are for people who show up to the health centers and to the hospital, Only people who show up to the health center and to the hospital. Jamaica, for example, has a bus. Jamaica retrofitted a bus where they are driving around. And if you want to get tested, you hop into the bus. They take a swab and then they take that swab back to the lab. We are going to continue to miss people. And if we keep missing people, we are going to continue every day to have the minister come on television, tell us no positive case. And then we are going to say to ourselves, boy, we Trinidad, like God really is a Trinity. So we're good to go. And then we're going to go back to life as normal. And then we would have to deal with the second and third wave because we did not do enough during this first wave to ensure that we identify people who have it, to ensure that we isolate them, and to ensure that we continually treat them. Because that is what needs to happen. That is what needs to happen. We need to test, we need to trace, we need to isolate. That is what needs to happen. And until we do enough tests to compare, imagine we have not done even 0.5 of the we have not tested even 0.5 of the population. We haven't tested 1%. Iceland has tested 6% of their population. We in Trinidad and Tobago, we have money, we have oil money, we have gas money. Well, that's questionable, but we had enough money to hire 4 private companies to supplement our TTPS. We had enough money to do that. Don't tell me we don't have enough money to expand on our testing. Don't tell me that, because that makes absolutely no sense, and I will not believe that. I do not believe that. As the minister says, I reject that outright because it is simply not true. So, Facebook, thank you all so much for listening. Thank you all so much for participating. Thanks to those who asked questions. I really just wanted to highlight these 2 things, that even though our Secretary for Health, Wellness and Family Development said that we are going to ramp up testing, I am not convinced that her expression of what is going to happen is actually what is really going to happen, particularly since we still have to send our samples to Trinidad to be tested. And they can then decide, we are not going to test these samples because they do not fall into the same category, or they don't fall, you are not using the same criteria that we are using in Tobago, which is why Tobago needed to be testing our own story from the beginning. We should have jumped at that, and we should have been testing our own stories from the beginning. And the second thing is this foolishness about not doing larger testing and not expanding it to even people who are asymptomatic is utterly foolish. And we are going to pay the price for that after, unfortunately. Unless, of course, God really is a Trinity, and we are the luckiest people under God's green earth. My dear, thank you all so much. Have a blessed and beautiful Monday. Bye.